but I just wanted to introduce to the group why we were sponsoring this webinar, talk a little bit about where we are as a profession currently and some of the barriers that have been raised in surveys and just empirical observation from the marketplace. Can you go to the next slide, please, Jerry? Thanks. So I'm drawing this from some research that has been done over the last few years. We'll probably just start with AuditNet. I think, given that they're the presenters of this program, actually take a leap back to 2012 when AuditNet did a survey of data analytics audit software use, and really kind of dismal results from that. The software tools around for 2 decades or more, but auditors were really not making full use of the software tools, generally in an ad hoc way with no particular strategy for integration in the audit process. The reasons given at the time for really lack of use was were 3 costs of the software, cost of training, and management resistance. So if we leap forward to 2016, you see in a broader survey done by AuditNet about audit technology capabilities and the needs assessment, that we're still at more or less at the same place. Internal audit is still only using basic technology, not really harnessing technology to the full benefit of their departments or their activities, and stakeholders are really asking for more than what internal audit is delivering with technology at the moment. Although, on the bright side, internal audit expressed plans for the future, have strategies in place for budgeting, have business cases built. So that looks promising, with offering some opportunities to definitely improve. You can go ahead one more, please. Thanks. So the next survey was called Staying Ahead, Internal Audit's Use of Technology. It was a report by Michael Kengemi based on the 2015 IIA CBOC, the Common Body of Knowledge study. And so in this survey, and I remember talking to Michael Kengemi about this, that he was quite pleased that the use of software tools for data mining had gone up 14%, but I reminded him that took 6 years to get there. So on an annual rate, that wasn't all that attractive. And fewer than 4 out of 10 chief audit executives really felt that their departments were using technology to its full benefit. So on to the next one, another CBOC benchmarking study. This one was done globally. It was really quite an interesting study that didn't show any particular variation around the world, but did show that, again, that a surprising number of internal auditors were relying still on manual systems and processes, less than 40% actively using audit software. This KPMG study was out of South Africa, but still, again, reinforces 60% of the survey respondents not effectively using analytics. And then, just wrapping up with this, the final study I wanted to quote was from Deloitte. This was done this year. The title of the study was called Evolution or Irrelevance, Internal Audit at the Crossroads. Rather intimidating title for the study, but again, reinforcing that the use of analytics is largely still at basic levels. While there is an expectation that the use of analytics will increase, there's still the same barriers. We're looking at talent gaps, problems with accessing quality data, and that really points to, where do we get started? So just one more slide, thanks. I guess, as vendors, we certainly have to take some responsibility. We're continuing to improve our software capabilities. We try to make it easier to use, make it more accessible to a broader group of auditors. We're also recognizing that we can't just sell software, so we've introduced a bundle of software and services with special pricing that allows small audit shops to get up and running with analytics at a sustainable annual cost. And we're doing some other things. We've got lots of how-tos, success stories on our YouTube channel, so I invite you to subscribe to that. And we're also sponsoring webinars such as this one, and I think what we're trying to do is give you access to respected professionals, and on that note, I'll turn it over to Jared.
Thanks, Bob. And I guess to start here is the impetus for this presentation has been a couple of different items. One was a recent presentation related to this topic in a recent article with Internal Auditor magazine, and basically analytics, it's better than guessing, and so hopefully it is better than guessing. Going back to Bob's comments, I think that we have several roadblocks that have continuously been in the way. Sometimes we may call these things excuses as well, and so hopefully today, if you get something out of this, it's the encouragement to start somewhere and getting motivated to start. In addition to that, we'll do a little bit of a brainstorming exercise. Clearly, there are many different industries and organization types represented within this webinar, and so we'll use a very generic type approach to brainstorming process. We'll talk about analytic methods and certain implementation tips that hopefully will assist you. By no means are any of these suggestions very specific to any one organization or industry from that perspective. And we'll start off with a polling question in regards to what is your internal audit department's most significant challenge related to data analytics.
And if you would take a moment to answer the polling question, there is no right or wrong answer. We're just looking for your responses to make sure that you're paying attention. So I'll be monitoring the polling question. In the meantime, we do have a question, Jared, that came in. What's a good definition that can be used at the upper management level to explain audit analytics?
A good definition. That one kind of caught me off guard. I guess I would say it's the use of data or transformation of data into information that assists in providing or improving decision making. And so I think we do this from different perspectives as far as what type of analytics that we are specifically using, and we'll talk about that a little bit with a model later on in the presentation.
Very good. Okay, we've got about 94% have voted. If you could go ahead, we'll leave the poll open for another 10 seconds or so. Register your votes and then we'll close it. Share the results. Okay, and we'll go ahead and we will close that poll and share the results. And Jared, it looks like pretty much even split among the challenges.
Yeah, so apparently management support's not the big pressure against it, but clearly staffing competence and resources are two that are quite well expected, as well as data availability. And I think that hopefully we'll talk a little bit about a few of these as we go through the presentation, because I think that one of the key strategies is the ability to either find the right resources or develop the right competencies within the staffing that you do have, as well as to look for data within the organization and outside of the organization. So hopefully we'll kind of tie in on a couple of these items here. And so excuses, one of the things that we have, we know many of different things about excuses, but as I was putting this together, one of the thoughts is that they only get in the way, right? I don't know where to start, and to me that's potentially a competency issue maybe, but you cannot start if you do not finish, and we've never done it that way. Okay, and so maybe that is a data availability or a competence excuse. And one of the questions there is, what if you had? What if you've been able to take certain aspects of analytics and apply them into audit? Could you audit smarter, or could you audit more effectively? I can't do it because of limited resources, and clearly that's one of the key things that were identified, whether it be time, staff, or money. Those can be hindrances, and I guess my point back to that is that it's a marathon. It's not a sprint, and just because you go full throttle today doesn't mean that you'll be ready tomorrow. The data doesn't exist, and so this is one thing that frequently you hear people say, but the question is, well, what data does exist? And that can be from two different aspects, internally as well as externally, depending upon the maturity of your data analytics program. And clearly, there are certain things that are well beyond the scope of a small audit shop until there are adequate resources. But the bottom line there is you cannot evaluate what you do not measure. And so what is our goal? And I think that goals are quite important when developing a data analytics program. More specifically, if you aim at nothing, we can keep on doing that without changing anything, right? But if you aim at nothing, then you're sure to hit it. And so it's not about where you start, but it's about what you achieve. And so whenever we think of ad hoc analytics, it's better than nothing, better than non-existent. And so if there are opportunities within your organization to add value, adding value through the use of data could be more efficient than other means. And what I mean by that is where are the points that you can start? What are the easy wins within the organization where data could be most helpful to your audit process? And so one way to consider that might be to think about what are business or what are the priorities of the business and management. And the reason that I think that this is a critical focus point is going back to management support. And so although management support was only the fourth strongest here, I think that hopefully finding more management support behind you to do this will hopefully help with the resource constraints that may exist. Clearly, this question here is going to depend upon the specific business, the specific management of that organization, as well as the industry that you operate in. Many different industries have many different challenges, and even within each industry, different businesses have many different challenges. And so it's to kind of find the right mix or the right focus to really market the value that can be added through the use of analytics. Talking back to the competence of staffing as well as staffing resources, and so I understand that a lot of audit shops would have difficulty in going and hiring what they call the unicorn, right? The mythical creature here that basically has an audit IQ as well as strong data analysis skills and business operation skills. And so, one of the things here is what staff do you already have at the table that might be eager to learn, has a thirst for learning new technology, learning new skills. And the other thing that I think is, the other two things that I think are critical with mapping this is the business knowledge within your own organization, as well as that inquisitive mind. I think one of the first steps that we often miss in talking about data analytics is just the critical thinking aspect. And that critical thinking aspect goes from considering basically what are the key business risks or what are the key opportunities that we have in front of us, to trying to tie that with internal data and external data that could exist to try to answer that question. So I truly believe it's a combination of many different factors. The other side to it is, we all or I shouldn't say we all, but many times we think about riding a bicycle. And I'm not sure, but I know that I fail many a times on that bicycle, but I think it was always better to fall and fail than to not try. And I think many a times we learn much more through the process when we find challenges and errors along the way. And another thing that I guess I frequently ask myself is the popularity of data analytics as it's become today. I think through many of the different analytical measures that we have used traditionally for many years now. Return on assets is a measurement of operating performance. Well, it truly is a data aspect. It's an analytic that we can use. Direct versus indirect unit costs or labor costs and turnover ratios and reorder points, even credit limits based off of credit ratings. And then this next one, forecast production planning, I think is quite specific to something that many organizations do, right? It's from the forecast perspective, and if we understand basically what's in the sales forecast and we have certain hit rates on that from a historical perspective, I think that that helps us to better plan our manufacturing to ensure, or ordering to ensure that we have adequate supply and inventory. And then another one that may take on the, or may be the most specific to internal audit, may be the Binford's Law application, or the law of first digits that is frequently used for certain audit tests. And so where do you want to go is one of the questions really. And so clearly it starts with having the questions and then understanding which data is captured. From that, I think that the next step is performing the descriptive analytics. And I think that most organizations have the ability to do this day one, to do this today, pending that they have the data and they know where it's at. Whenever we start getting into predictive analytics is probably a step further. And that predictive analytics is, well, based off of the past, what's the prediction of the future? And based off of that prediction, then what should be the response that we might have? And I look a lot at the predictive analytics, kind of tying that back to what we just talked about with the sales forecast and ensuring that we manufacture our order to fulfill those sales, being kind of the next step in that prescriptive analytics. Now clearly this can apply to more than just the revenue cycle, of course. It can apply to many different areas in nearly every area within your organization. And so the value, or adding value, depends upon that specific goal that you set, or that specific question that you add. And it's about, where do you want to go? Is it about increasing revenue? And so I'm not sure if you saw this, but it was quite interesting that I guess Starbucks recently implemented or brought back its pumpkin spice drink due to the time of year being fall. And apparently they've done analysis to be able to see that they're able to upsell more to people that actually buy a pumpkin spice coffee. So that revenue component, if you think about Amazon and Amazon's ability to basically predict what else you might want to purchase based off of other customer purchases. Other opportunities may be to identify areas as far as expenditures that may be able to be reduced, to identify certain risk that we might be able to manage, or to evaluate and improve controls or compliance, and even safety. Something as simple as safety, and you know, what kind of records does the organization keep related to safety accidents? I mean, what about days of the week, time of the day? What about the weather, depending upon if it's inside or outside? Clearly, these are things that maybe from that perspective, if we have the data, or if we're able to capture that data, then maybe it's one quick reminder in regards to the certain specific item that can help reduce safety concerns. And so with that, we have our next polling question. And so, which functions in your department have the most mature data analytics staff and functions? And so this is outside of internal audit. What types of data analysis is going on?
I've launched that polling question, and we have a very relevant comment that came in from Jane. Why create a separate standalone analytics process and systems for internal audit? Analytics is a current hot topic for management. Most big businesses are focusing on data analysis. Internal audit should be partnering with management to enhance management analytics. If an analytic is interesting enough for IA, it should be interesting for management. We should empower them and support them with performing the analysis and monitoring. For that to work, the analytics should be developed in management's reporting system and not in separate analytic tools. And I don't know about you, Jared, but in my practical experience, whenever I used analytics and brought it to management, frequently they would ask, well, that's great. Where is this tool, and can we have access to it? So I think once internal audit exposes management to these types of tools that they might not have seen before from an internal audit perspective, I think it opens up that conversation.
And Jim, I completely agree with that, and I agree with the comment that's made. I think it goes back to the point, and it's to a certain extent for me, it's related to ERM even as well. We have certain management functions that maybe haven't been built anywhere, and so from a value, if we're talking about something that's going to add value to the organization, to a certain extent, that's within the internal audit's definition, or the definition of internal audit. And so that's also where this question comes from, is to gain an understanding of, do we know what analytics are already out in the field, in the business, and how can either internal audit leverage that, or how can internal audit work where there are voids to assist in the development of certain analytics. And so I don't think that there is one right answer for everybody. I just think, though, that if analytics is missing within the organization, then I think that we would probably have some serious concerns, and I think that it provides a void for where we could add value. Now, once we close the polling, I may have some additional comments to that as well. And so, is it now closed?
It is now closed, and the results are up there.
Okay. And so now all of a sudden we see analytics, the highest rate here is within IT/information security. And whenever I think about this, it goes back to my comments related to ensuring that the person has the right business aptitude within the organization. And so whenever I see that we have IT/information security that are providing the largest component of that, I guess my question is, how much of that is also related to the operations or the other areas within the business versus if it's only related to IT. And so I think that IT can create many of these, but the question is, what's the driver and how is it being driven to ensure that adequate information is provided. The other side to that is, in looking at operations and looking at marketing and sales, I also figured that those two would be two of the most used, maybe not in that order, but it's not a significant surprise. And I think that that's leads us pretty well into this next area. And my suggestion here is just from an inventory and opportunity perspective, and specifically outside of internal audit, what are the efforts? Because clearly, as the point was made, we don't want to duplicate efforts when there is no need to do so. And so what is being done by whom and for what? And based off of that is internal audit leveraging any of these other analytics within the organization? And if not, can they be leveraged? Can they be leveraged in the annual risk assessment, or can they be leveraged in the micro level risk assessment for a specific audit that's being performed? Another question to that, and I think it's quite important, is are these processes being audited? So if it's outside of internal audit, what assurance is there on the process? What assurance is there on the data that's coming into that process, especially if it's external more so than just internal, because modification of some of this information can clearly change decisions that are being made relying upon the underlying data. Tied to that is what data is available and who really owns that data. And so internally, one of the things that we kind of discussed is that availability of data is an obstacle. And so within the organization, within your organization, is it IT that owns the data, or is it the specific functional manager that has ownership of the data in that sense, that can provide access to it? In addition to that, depending upon what type of organization that you are, what are the external data sources that might exist, from considerations of Twitter and Yelp, Facebook, and other aspects that may be used to provide information about your organization? Are there changes as far as revenues that might take place based upon some of these technologies or certain information that is getting out? And with that said, I mean, it could even be, even external, could be external competitor information too, and how that impacts your ability to increase revenues. And so one of the things, and this goes back to the critical thinking comment, and I think that, you know, SAS 99, whenever we talk about fraud risk and brainstorming, I think there's quite a bit of evidence out there that shows that it can be quite effective. And so I think that from the perspective of data analytics, I think that brainstorming could also be quite useful here too. And so, you know, what are some of the questions that you might have within your organization related to operations, or related to risk, or related to controls? And so from that perspective, or from that question, can you identify any data points that could be used to try to analyze those items? And then the other part to that is who within your team or within your organization might have the skills to lead such an initiative. And so really generic example that I have here is just, and it kind of works towards brainstorming, or potentially how brainstorming would work, but it's church offerings. And so how would you analyze church offerings? So if you were looking for to be able to more accurately predict the inflow of cash, how would you better be able to do that? And clearly, so one piece of information is knowing the weekly deposit. Well, what about other pieces of information that may not be the deposit itself? What about attendance? What about attendance at different services? Or are there other events that are taking place? We know that within churches, a lot of times holidays are the most attended services. What about weather? How does a rainstorm during a specific service impact attendance? Here in Baton Rouge, sometimes we have this thing called a football game that might impact attendance. Another consideration tied to that might be, well, you know, are there auto pay or direct transfers of money? In addition to that, what about the week of the month? All of these things can have a direct impact on what is captured in the church offerings at any given time. And so I think the points or the point there is just, what pieces of information, what pieces of data can help me to answer the question? And I think that directly tied in there is, do I understand the business and the operating cycle? Do I understand my customer, or do I understand my vendors and my employees? And so from that perspective, how do I confirm the accuracy and the completeness of data? And does data represent understanding of a process? So what I mean there is, a lot of times we have descriptive statistics that may be able to shine some light onto different factors that we have that may say, well, we think that the business is operating at this level, but whenever we look at certain other maybe non-financial factors, all of a sudden we don't understand how it's possible, right? And so we may have red flags there. What are the causes that might influence a relationship? And so we'll talk a little bit about different statistical measures, but sometimes we have correlation, but within correlation we're only looking at two items moving at the same time, as opposed to considering other things that may impact that relationship. And so that might be important. What sources contain the data, and then what preparation needs to be made to the data. And so I think that once we have an inventory of the data, and once we understand what data is available, clearly there may be certain pieces of data that require a lot more work than other items. And so clearly with a small audit shop, I think that that's where a lot of work becomes overbearing. And so it's about identifying the easy targets first to get momentum and motivation. And so just as we're talking about the statistical methods that you can use, or you potentially should use, to evaluate relationships, clearly visualization is one of the ones that has really taken off quite a bit recently. And it's the same thing I tell my students, is that pictures are worth 1,000 words. The only problem with a picture is sometimes you lose sight of certain detailed events that might be driving the whole visual. And so it's important to not only be able to see the visualization, but it's also important to have drill down capabilities to identify certain aspects of it. Correlation, again, is just limited to two items varying together, whether it be positively or negatively. One of the things that directly could be seen there, and I'm not sure how many of you have seen the press releases on it, but certain organizations actually, retail organizations, actually would look at the weather to determine whether or not to bring employees in that were scheduled to work at a given point in time. And so some of that has come under quite a bit of legal scrutiny, if you will. And then lastly is regression. And so from a regression analysis perspective, what are all the factors that may modify a relationship? And so here, whether it be looking at the day of the week and the week of the month, various different aspects could come together all at once to modify a relationship. And you could even throw weather into that factor. You could throw seasonality into the factor there. And so what tools do I need? And I think that one of the things that continuously pops up is related to tools. And I think that with tools, it's a matter of personal preference. A lot of times I hear people, saying that one tool is so much better than another, and vice versa. Whenever I can look at both tools, and it really just depends upon what you're introduced to first and what you become more comfortable with. And so these are just a couple more questions and that I tried to throw out just to try to drive some thinking, some critical thinking in regards to potentially what questions you might have within your own organization. Clearly it depends upon the perspective that you have, the perspective of your management, as well as many other factors. But you can see it in lots of places. And so just at the airport, right, what is the cost of overbooking a flight? And so whenever you think about it, nowadays there's basically an auction that takes place to determine whether or not a seat's going to be given up. And so as long as the seat was priced at a rate over what it takes to put another customer on a different flight, then basically they've created a win-win situation while maintaining customer loyalty and overselling flights. How can I reduce fuel costs? And so maybe reducing fuel costs deals with certain aspects of driving protocols or driving procedures as far as taking left turns versus right turns, and also the mapping software that's used. And clearly, potentially that would also tie in with delivery times. What about insurance costs and reducing accidents? Well, there's analytics that are now out there from devices that can determine driving patterns, that can determine acceleration rates and stop rates. And so there are tons of devices that are now out there, and we usually refer to those as the Internet of Things, that can now, information can be pulled from. Other considerations might be, how might a new competitor impact your organization, or how does weather impact an organization? And so clearly I think if we would think of various aspects of retail, depending upon where we're at and what the weather event is, that weather can impact operations. One of the things that I think I remember reading somewhere was whenever you look at hurricanes coming in, clearly besides certain beverage types, water and other things, there's also one specific item that I believe it's Walmart that sells a whole lot of, that they get prepped for, and that's Pop-Tarts, just because they don't have to be heated. And so certain weather patterns can also impact sales and what you need to be able to get on the shelf. Other things might be, well, you know, how does a 210 net 30 impact collections or even revenue if it's implemented? Or in the case of some small businesses, what about Apple Pay? How would it impact me? Would it help me to increase my sales? Or would it detract if I force it upon it? And so I think that the right recipe has many different ingredients. But I think that the first thing is, what do you want to understand? It's the critical, it's the inquisitive mind, the questions that are asked, and then it's the critical thinking that can help utilize data to solve those questions that you might have. Certain other questions, you know, what is the frequency of credit limits, or the frequency at which they're overridden, and are there certain people that are the ones that are continuously overriding those credit limits, and why? Because then that creates, you know, the question of, is this if we're going to continuously override credit limits, is it working as a control? Or do we need to go back and reevaluate our customers' credits? You know, how frequently do stockouts occur, and why are they occurring? Is there something that we can identify that is driving those stockouts? And then the last thing might be related to purchasing, and more specifically the buyers. Are they over-relying on certain buyers, and if so, what is the cost of them doing that? So I think that these three components provide a lot of opportunity to get where we need to go. Additional methods, we've already talked about some of these. Descriptive statistics, clearly we as auditors frequently understand the use of means and ranges, but I'm not sure how often we use them. So whenever we start looking at outliers, are we looking at standard deviations and taking and keeping an eye on transactions that are occurring outside 3 standard deviations from the mean. Do we focus on certain aspects like that? And I understand, we're talking small audit shops and resources and capabilities. Well, sometimes this may mean that we have the ability to run analytics, but maybe not the resources to follow up on those analytics. Can some of those things be driven out or provided back to the to management of the specific group that's responsible for the actions? Can it be that we use more of a self-assessment approach where we ask management to provide feedback on what's going on here, so at least they understand that there's potential concerns with certain transactions? We've talked a bit about correlation and regression already, as well as visualization. But again, a lot of times there's a concern, and even within our younger generation of current college students, in regards to fear of technology. And the question here is, what software do I need? And I don't think that that's really the question. I think the question is more, what is it that I want to do, and what software can fulfill me, can help me to do that? I think that it does, that the familiarity with the software and the ability, the user friendliness of it are the critical questions, because once those are resolved, I think that there are many questions that can be answered. And so, looking at relationships and predictions, because that's kind of the goal, moving from descriptive statistics to predictive analytics and prescriptive analytics. Well, several different factors that we have, or several pieces of information. We go back and talk about Twitter and Yelp and these things, right? So the marketing and the social media aspects, those things can really drive performance, negatively as well as positively, so it can be either direction. Financial performance of the organization and operations. So clearly, what information do we have? Most of that's going to be all internal. What are we doing from a competitor performance data standpoint? Are we bringing in information from within our industry, from our direct competitors, and even beyond just those? Of course, economic indicators and certain trends that we foresee. And then lastly, customer service. And so customer service, yes, it may be late in the game in some cases, but it can also be early in the game to provide a predictive analytic, so that potentially what we can do is we can prescribe fixes, or we can identify fixes in the next generation of product, or in the next service opportunity that we have with customers. And so it can drive our training as well as other opportunities that we have. And so here I think that we've already talked about the picture being worth 1,000 words, but outliers and anomalies, if we're not looking at them, then what are we missing is one of the questions that I would have. Correlation is somewhat beneficial, but it's only a question of, do two things move together? And so, I mean, clearly I know that temperature rises in the summer, right? Time series, and so how much do we know about time series transactions? Year over year, month over month, day over day, hour over hour, certain times. I mean, this could well take place in both banking and retail as well. Regarding queuing, as far as lines, I don't know. I know there's several retailers that I can predict that there's going to be a long line at on Sunday afternoons. If I go there, it turns out that there's a long line there, despite the ability to predict that within time series. So how much or potentially could that impact your customer relationship management? Clustering or grouping of events and activities, and so very similar to what we have or what we see from an Amazon perspective or some kind of predictive perspective of customers buying certain things together. So it's pattern analysis. regression and being able to control for various different aspects. What is the true control? And then lastly, the fraud detection techniques, Benford's Law that I spoke about earlier. And I think here this maturity classification slide kind of goes back to that last question that we talked about. And you know, if analytics are non-existent within the organization, I think that internal audit's a great place for them to start. Is it internal audit's responsibility, or is it a management activity or management responsibility to basically be monitoring, right? Because when we talk about analytics, we are talking about managing the business. We are talking about, yes, there are advantages from an audit perspective, but we're also talking about value-added activities, and those are also management's responsibility. But if it's non-existent, then I think that ad hoc is better than nothing, and getting to the point of repeatable analysis. Now, certain organizations readily view internal audit as to provide tools to assist management, and then to, once they're developed, to turn them over to management. Clearly we have various different types of internal audit shops and various different opportunities to add value based off upon our charter, as well as the expectations of our audit committee and executive management. The goal here is, you know, can we get it to a repeatable analysis? Can we get it to continuous? Can we get it to continuous monitoring, in which we know that management's going to own that? But what opportunities are we missing out on if we turn our backs on it? So whether data analytics exists within the organization inside or outside of internal audit, there's always a question of the integrity of the data and the accuracy of the data. The last thing that we want to do is to make bad decisions because we have bad data. That's really not worth the investment opportunity. Do we audit it? How timely is the information that we're getting? The other thing is confidentiality, and so ensuring that only a limited group of individuals have access to it, and do they have the right access? So it's very specific, very consistent with what we frequently do whenever we think of our internal controls test related to financial reporting and who can, and the segregation of duties considerations. And then lastly is availability. When can it be accessed and where can it be accessed from? And, you know, are we recording any downloads or any information related to how it may be being taken externally or outside? And that brings us to our last polling question, and that is, which business process might be a good starting point for your initial data and analytics opportunity? And clearly I left internal audit out of here because the question is more from the perspective of which of these groups could data analytics help internal audit better?
Okay, I've launched the question and the polling question, and if you could take a minute to indicate your response. We do have a lot of questions that came in, Jared. Perhaps here's one for Bob. The audit committee and management support is the key to resources, staffing, and data availability. How can a chief audit executive strengthen management support?
Well, I guess there's lots of little strategies, but I think it's more turning it around the other way and saying the audit committee expects internal audit to be doing this. In fact, you should be demonstrating your capability rather than you know, trying to prove to the audit committee that this is something valuable to support. From the surveys that I've read, the audit committees really expect you to be doing this, and there's an expectation gap.
Okay, and perhaps you could give some suggestions for specific areas that a small internal audit shop could target to start implementing data analytics, perhaps Jared? And I think you've given some examples already, but maybe...
Yeah, I think it depends upon where you've been and what you've learned from those recent audits. I hope that every time an audit is completed, even if analytics wasn't used, on the backside a question could be asked of how could I have better used analytics for this audit. Clearly some of the areas that have traditionally used certain analytics have been within expenditure reporting. You know, whenever I look at information security here, one of the things that that I think about is taking a look at phishing attempts and where those IP addresses are coming from. That's an analytic to gain an understanding of where are threats coming from and certain aspects of those threats. Even human resources, from the perspective of taking a look at even salary changes or changes that are taking place outside of a normal cycle of pay rate increases. I think that what I'm getting after is that the opportunities are really endless, but you have to, it has to be within your own organization. I think that the individual that knows the organization the best has the best opportunity to determine where the best starting point is from their own organization. Because otherwise it's you know, it's just somebody else's analytic.
Okay, I agree. Before I close the poll, I just wanted to give two observations that and things that resonated with me and what you said. And one is you said that all you really need is an eagerness to learn, and I think that that really rings true, that, you know, most internal auditors are hesitant to get started in this, and all you need to do is just take that first step. The other thing is, I think, is you need to start early. Too many times I saw in my experience in internal audit that the internal auditors would wait too late to come to those who were handling the data analytics to make it meaningful for the audits that they were working on. So I would recommend starting the planning for this during the you know, when you're doing the current and long-range audit plan, and then when you're doing the actual project planning. I think those two techniques really helped me when we finally did implement analytics into our audit process. So let me go ahead and close the poll and share the results and turn it back to you, Jared.
Okay, and so clearly here operations and purchasing are two of the major areas where it appears as though the attendees believe that analytics could provide a good start. My best guess is with marketing, sales, and consumer service or customer service. The lower response rate there is likely as a result of the analytics that this group has already done, and so potentially they could also provide information that could be used throughout other facets of the organization. And so going back to the inventory and knowing what's being done and where, I think is a critical step. But we don't, again, kind of going back to the other person, you know, is it a problem that it's in silos, or is it provide a benefit that it's more specific and focused? And so in kind of beginning to wrap this up, I think that there are several takeaways that hopefully come from this, and I think it's, you know, the fact that analytics, it's a tool for the toolbox, and it doesn't replace many of things. Many of things are required to be able to effectively use analytics, and those things are what we've already talked about, the business knowledge and the inquisitiveness, so that we can focus on where to go with the analytics, the professional skepticism that when something is not does not appear right, the relationship does not appear right, then potentially we need to look deeper. Clearly communication and the objectivity that we approach this with are also quite important to communicate the added value or the potential to add value as well as the results. I think another thing to consider goes directly back to what you just said, Jim, and that's scalability is key. And so instead of waiting, I think planning is the critical point there. And so yes, we may start small, but it's better than not starting. And the other side to that is, a lot of times when you rush, you set yourself up for greater failure. Now there's a difference between not starting at all and not rushing, and we need to balance those two to ensure that we do get a start. Understanding the data availability and who owns it, where is it located, what's the format, and how is it monitored, so that we can better understand the accuracy of our results. Build and learn and build. And what I mean by that is starting small and creating momentum, getting or training the staff that's necessary, and hopefully continuing to ask new questions that can provide certain value. The last takeaway, I think, is we get bombarded with this term big data. And big data is a goal. It's nowhere near a starting point. And the organizations that are talking about big data or actually using big data today are very large organizations that have been spending time on analytics for years now. And so I would say don't let the lack of big data capabilities get in the way. Add value where you can, to maximize success. Take the easy wins that you can gain, and hopefully that will lead to increased growth, maturity, and resource allocation. And then expand to new data through maturity by asking those new questions. Apply the new knowledge and the data that you've begun to build. And then clearly the last thing is this unstructured data. It's a goal. It's not the starting point, and if you focus too much on unstructured data, I think that you're setting yourself up to crash quick.